So I'm Matt Daler. I graduated from Middlebury in 2006. I work in the alumni office, and part of my job is planning chapter and regional events around the world. And of course, like everyone else last March, in the alumni office, we had to quickly pivot to virtual events like this one. And happy to share it with you today. So the flagship of our digital programming since COVID has started has sort of been the Faculty at Home webinar series. I hope some of you might have had the opportunity to check that out. We recently had our 25th talk since late April, and we're looking forward to announcing our winter and spring speakers. The other successful series that we've launched has been Middlebury Wine School. Hopefully many of you have had a chance to join us for one of those. And this month we're taking a break from wine, and we're thrilled to offer something for the beer lovers out there. So as I said, we're getting ready to announce the winter and spring speakers and Faculty at Home. We're working on the next edition of Wine School, and we're always adding new programming, everything from author talks to yoga and fitness classes. So keep your eyes on your inboxes and the events calendar, which we'll send out. I know we're all eager to get to the tasting. We just take a quick moment to cover some of the logistics of the meeting. As I said before all of you were in, your microphones are all muted, and you're welcome to have your cameras on or off, whichever you prefer. You're actually not able to unmute yourselves, but if you do have a question, please put it in the chat to everyone. And then I'll be, to allow Greg to focus on the tasting, I will be sort of keeping an eye on the chat. And I'll try and chime in with a question or two after each beer we taste. And maybe if we have any time at the end, I'll throw a few more in. But there's a lot of us, and we're tight on time, so we may not be able to get to everyone's questions. So please bear with us if we don't. Tasting is going to run just about an hour, and we'll try to end pretty promptly so everyone can get on with their evenings. And we will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered, hopefully tomorrow. If not, then Monday. It'll have a recording of the tasting, so don't worry about taking notes. If you miss anything, you'll get to see it again. So tonight, we're very fortunate to be joined by Greg Engert, who graduated from Middlebury College in 2002. Greg's a partner and the beverage director for the Neighborhood Restaurant Group, which has 18 food and beverage related businesses in the Washington, D.C. area. Just over a year ago, they opened the Grand Delancey, their first venture in New York, where some of you probably picked up the beers for tonight's tasting. Grand Delancey was featured in the New York Times Restaurant Preview in the fall of 2019, and Imbibe magazine named it their 2020 Beer Bar of the Year. In 2010, Food and Wine named Greg one of their sommeliers of the year. Greg was the first beer professional to receive that honor. In 2012, he was a nominee for James Beard Foundation's Outstanding Wine and Spirits Professional. We've got bedtime going on in the background here, you can probably hear. In 2014, Imbibe magazine named him Beer Person of the Year, and Washington Business Journal included Greg on their 40 under 40 list in 2017. In addition to these honors, Greg has been featured in such media outlets as the New York Times, Food and Wine, the Washington Post, Men's Health, Salon, Slate, and Beer Advocate. He's also appeared on Food Network's Burgers, Brew, and Q, Esquire Network's Best Bars in America, and Cooking Channel's Foodography. NPR's The Splendid Table, and Martha Stewart Living. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Greg Engert. Greg, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks so much, Matt. I was just trying to catch up with some of these questions about the beers. So yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. This is a real thrill to be able to drink not just some beers with you, but these classic beers. And just a quick note on what you're drinking. I tried to select beers that were relatively available, which is amazing that in 2020, you can get these beers pretty easily. When I got started in the industry almost 20 years ago now, it was really, really difficult to get your hands on any of these beers. So their relative ubiquity is a sign that all of the work we've been doing on their behalf stateside here has been impactful. And that's a very cool thing for sure, because these beers are incredible. So it sounds like everybody was able to get the Saison DuPont. Any kind of Saison will do for that one. West Malt Triple, if you have any triple or some kind of Belgian Strong Blonde Ale, that'll work. When we finish with the St. Bernardus Christmas Ale, holiday beers in general from Belgian brewers, or Belgian strong dark ales like Chimay Grand Reserve. Any of the Rochefort beers would work for that too. I'm realizing I should have included this information in the email. But yeah, the first beer we're going to start with is probably the most difficult to find. So if any kind of lambic works out well, whether it's framboise or kriek or gueuze, which is what we're going to be drinking. And the last thing I like to say before I do these tastings, which based on the craziness that has been 2020, I seem to do nightly, feel no pressure to drink everything. If you just want to crack one beer and sip it throughout, of course, that's fine. Some of you I see are with others, so you can share them. And then others may just want to plow through all four of these and pretend it's an average Thursday night at Middlebury back in the day. So without further ado, we're gonna drink the first beer. I deliberately didn't pour it yet, just to kind of talk about this. One of the great things that's happened with beer drinking over the past couple of decades is that people began to drink out of glassware, and now, unfortunately, need to be reminded of it. The can culture has gotten so intense that more and more people are drinking directly from that vessel. Don't necessarily encourage that because foam is everything for beer. And when it comes to taste and texture and aroma. So I'm pouring the Drie Fonteinen now. Always want to try to build a nice big frothy head on the beer like this. That's a good thing. Beer, unlike wine, whether it's sparkling or still, and unlike cider, whether it's sparkling or still, is filled with a lot of residual starches and dextrins and proteins. And so the effervescence built through fermentation and maturation and conditioning are actually held together, is actually held together in the big rocky retention of foam that we have, particularly in Belgian beers. And this is so important because all that CO2 that's trying to escape from the beer has volatile aromatic compounds tethered to each of those bubbles. And as those bubbles come to the surface with organic and chemical compounds from the beer, they get trapped in this kind of netting of foam and build that head. So as the beer sits in the glass and as the foam subsides, we get really intense pops of aroma that you wouldn't get by just sucking the beer out of a can or pouring it to the top with no head like they did in the old days. So pouring beer like this is important. It also contributes to the incredible textural character that you get from beer. That interplay of beer and foam is really important on the palate. And Belgian brewers go to a lot of lengths to make sure that the foam character is what it is. They re-ferment and bottle in the same way that sparkling wine producers do. And then they condition the bottles for 6 months plus, oftentimes, as in the case with this lambic that we're about to taste, to make sure that that head is really incredible, as you see here. So just like with wine tasting, we're going to drink beer and approach beer in the same way. We'd like to examine the color of the beer. One other important thing is when you're pouring beer from Belgian bottles, know that there's going to be a sediment of yeast that remains in the bottle. And we never want to pour that into the glass. So pouring it slowly will make sure that the beer might have a little bit of haze to it, but it shouldn't be chunky. There shouldn't be particulate matter. We're going to dive right in with some swirling and aromatic investigation. And then go right into the sip. So I wanted to start out with lambic as a category, because whether you're a beer drinker or a spirits drinker, wine drinker, lambic is a style of beer that kind of transcends all those categories. And it presents to me a sensory experience that, if you love food and drink, should not be missed. And it's a style that people who don't even love beer, maybe don't like hop bitterness or don't like malt sweetness, can get into because there's so much going on. It is the oldest modern beer style. There's proof of this style being brewed in Brussels and the surrounding Pajottenland, which is a now semi-rural region surrounding Brussels and Belgium. that's known for producing spontaneously fermented beers like lambic. And this has been being brewed for about 600 years with very few changes to the method or ingredients utilized in creating this beer. So it's incredibly special for that. And, if beer has been being brewed for 10,000 plus years, which it has been slowly evolving and then more recently rapidly evolving in production methods to further kind of control the processes that lead to replicable flavor. Science, technology has sped up over the last few hundred years to let brewers create clean flavors and replicate them. Lambic is a throwback to a time when brewers had no idea how to control or harness the science behind beer, but rather relied on empiricism to make sure that beer tasted as delicious as it could every time. They tried to do their best with empiricism to get the beers where they wanted, not exactly understanding what was going on in the beer. And so when you look at the tradition of lambic brewing, what's so cool is that they utilize a lot of unmalted wheat, because the loamy topsoil of the Payotton land happens to be perfect for growing wheat and fruit. And so it was quite available. It didn't have to just be held aside for bread making. They boiled for hours and hours at a time, unknowingly creating melanoidins, which yeast and bacteria that float around our heads all the time had more trouble fermenting. And so they were able to make a wild beer that actually tastes controlled, that tastes composed. And I'll talk a little bit about how they do that in a second. To back up for a minute on Belgian beer, a lot of what we have in American beer making today is based on the work of Belgians. And if you go back to the end of the 19th century, there are about 4,000 breweries in Belgium, which is a country the size of the state of Maryland. About the same time, there were 4,000 breweries in the United States. Both countries lost a lot of breweries in the 20th century through consolidation. But the Belgians never quite got down as far as we did. In 1980, there were only about 80 breweries in the US. As I think we all know, that's bounced back dramatically to the point where today there's 8,000 breweries in the US and actually over 100 in Maryland. But Belgium has stayed strong at about 150 to 160 for the past couple decades. And they've done that largely through export. When you go over there, there's fantastic beer connoisseur bars, but a lot of the general public tends to drink fizzy alternatives in the same manner that Americans do. So it's a lot based on American drinkers and brewers that the Belgian scene has survived. And I think for all of us today, it's great to return to these beers because once again, the Belgians are offering us more complexity, I think, in many ways, and more variety of flavor than we're getting from American beers. The market for craft in America today is dominated by sweetness again, the way it was dominated by Coca-Cola in the 20th century. We have hazy IPAs, fruited sours, and pastry stouts. And while I love all three of those styles, these kinds of mixed fermentation beers and strong dry beers and dry and hoppy saisons have kind of fallen by the wayside. So this is an effort to kind of bring them back to the forefront. This beer that we're drinking right now is a blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old spontaneously fermented ales that have been aged in oak barrels. It's made from a very simple recipe of at least 40% wheat. The rest is malted barley. They use old hops because if you use new hops, you get a lot of bitterness, and bitterness and acid can kind of clash with one another. By using old hops, though, you continue to have the antibacterial properties that will fight off infection and make sure that only pleasing bacteria and yeast get into this beer to give us the flavors that we want. Same thing, like I said before, with the long boil. After the beer is done, after the wort, which is just the unfermented sugar water, is hopped and finished before it goes into those barrels, it's super hot. After a boil, it's close to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can't put it directly into a tank and expect it to ferment. Up until the mid-19th century, all brewers around the world would use something called a cool ship to let the beer cool overnight. And this is just a wide, shallow stainless steel pan that sits at the top of the brewery. You put the wort in it overnight. and it cools off. You only do this between the fall and spring. If you try to use the cool ship in the summertime, it gets so hot that you're going to encourage some unwanted bacterial infections into the beer. So after it cools off overnight, it goes into oak barrels, where there are typically a host of microbes waiting to feast on the sugars of the wort that's come in, right? These microbes, these are over 100 different microbes they found in lambic at this point. 18 different yeasts or so, something like 6 to 8 different bacterias are sitting in the wood, chewing on cellubiose, the carbohydrate in the wood, waiting for new sugar sources to arrive. And when that happens, they set upon it. The bacterial fermentation gives us this kind of earthy quality that you get in the beer, a little bit of a barnyard note. That's from Enterobacter that starts off the fermentation. Then comes in ale and lager yeast that's just naturally occurring. That's going to give you some of the citrus notes, a hint of sulfur. Next will come really positive bacteria like lactobacillus and pediococcus that will bring in lush, intense acidity. And then finally, we have a family of yeasts called Brettanomyces, multiple strains that will come through to produce flavors that range from leather and pie cherry to earthy barnyard funk, like I mentioned, and pineapple. Altogether, you get this incredibly complex beer that's typically under 7% alcohol, as this one is. A mild acidity that's not sour. It's merely tart. This comes from the bacterial fermentation. And everything is in its right place. And I just want to stress this, even though it's spontaneously fermented, nothing is being tossed into this beer. It's what the beer is made of. It's that unmalted wheat. It's how it's made with the turbid mash and the long boil and the old hops that controls and keeps many of those airborne yeast and bacteria at bay, and only kind of allows the best ones in to do the work that you're tasting here. Last thing I'll say is the bottle, once this is bottled, this is about probably a combination of anywhere from 60% 1-year-old, 30% 2-year-old lambic, and 10% 3-year-old lambic. The 3-year-old being the funkiest and the driest, and the 1-year-old being the lightest and brightest with some sugars. It re-ferments in bottle. It's called gueuze, and it's a cool thing. So the thing about Belgian brewing is that I think we all think like, oh my God, the Belgians make crazy amounts of beers that influence the world. They've been as influenced as other brewing styles and traditions as we have. And so while Belgium is a country that was officially built in 1831, it's always been a kind of border country. It exists in the beer belt that stretches from the Czech Republic to the British Isles. The Celts spread, grain fermentation. And it's been a border country that's been ruled by Burgundians and the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, always kind of provincial, always remaining sort of fragmented. So these little traditions have survived as they have also been influenced by more global traditions. So in the case of gueuze, lambic's been being made for 600 years, but until the mid-19th century, it was just funky, still, mildly acidic beer, hopefully, that would be served from oak casks. Once beers like cask bitters from England started coming over to Belgium, and pilsners from the Czech Republic and eventually Germany started coming in they were clarified and they were carbonated. Nobody wanted to drink the murky old still lambic anymore. And so largely bar owners started to take these barrels of older lambic and produce a sparkling beverage in bottles for the first time in the mid-19th century. So what we have here is a 600-year-old beer style of lambic that transformed into gueuze based on the influence of pilsner and bitter in the mid-19th century.
Would this be an okay time for a couple of questions, Greg, on
totally.
this beer? Great.
And everybody pour your next beer too, sorry. Good stuff.
So one question we had was when you mentioned old hops, this Chuck Theobald, and I was wondering the same thing. Are old hops aged, or are meaning like they've been off the vine a long
Yeah.
time? Or okay, I see.
Harvested from vine and dried like all hops, and then aged in burlap sacks for um, years at a time. What happens with that is you lose the bitterness, but you don't lose the bacteriostatic properties. And so you're still and actually lambics are pretty well hopped. I mean, you get some bitterness in this. That's from tannins mostly, but a little bit of hop character as well. Tannins from the oak. So you can fight off some of those bigger bacteria, that could come in and make the beer taste like vinegar or worse by using old hops, but not have a kind of bitter, sour, muddled mess on the palate.
Very cool. And let's see, it was Sandy Durst pointed out that these bottles have best buy dates on them, and they're very far in the future. Mine is 26 October 2037. His is 2039. So is this really designed to cellar and be put up for a long time?
100%. Aged goose is one of the most remarkable things to lay down, even at 7% alcohol. Lay it down on its side so it can remain, the cork can remain moist, and oxidation will be slowed. They can last for even longer than that, but regulations from governments make us add silly things to our beer labels. Oftentimes, I could go into that for what happens in America, but yeah. So it's fun with the lambic producers that they have a little fun with it. You'll see some best by dates on the others as well. The St. Bernardus has a 4-year best by date. I think the Westmalle Triple has a 2-year. Both of those can lay down as well.
Cool, awesome. And if you're not going to get through this entire bottle tonight, how long will it survive in the fridge before it goes flat? Probably.
If you put a stopper on it, it's going to lose its effervescence overnight and not be as great tomorrow. So I would
drink up.
think it's nice. No, I mean, you can do it. It's not going to be as good. I guess that's one of the reasons why the 750 milliliter format has lost a little bit of its luster. Less people are sharing these kinds of beers, I think, particularly during COVID. But yeah, you kind of want to get after it if you can.
Thank you. That's great.
Should we do the next one? Everybody have a Saison of sorts. Saison DuPont is the benchmark of the style. It's a beer that almost went out of production in the 80s and 90s, got saved by American importing and popularity in the States, as did, frankly, many different Belgian style beers. And it's become the benchmark. That said, the idea of Saison as a style is pretty ridiculous in historical terms, because there's no such thing as Saison as a style until probably the 80s or 90s, when it gets really, really tethered to DuPont. Even in the 80s and 90s, you'd find Saisons from Belgium, so-called and labeled, that are dark in color. I've seen them that are sour, certainly. Some are spicy, some are hoppy, some are strong, some are low in alcohol. Saison is kind of more of a state of mind or a method to fulfill a need historically than it is a style, but it's become one. So historically, Saisons refer to a season, and that season is summer, so Saison Diet. And it comes from the seasonal brewing I was kind of touching on before, which is before the Beaudelat heat exchanger, which allowed wort to go from 200 degrees down to 50 or 60 very quickly. All brewers use these cool ships to cool their wort before fermentation. And that's mid to late 19th century. Same with refrigeration. So before the mid to late 19th century, all brewing was a seasonal operation. You really could not brew earlier than September, October, and you didn't want to brew any later than March or April, because when you brew in warmer months, you welcome in unwanted bacteria. That said, the need to drink is a year-round occurrence, and so brewers had to get smart about how they would brew beer in the proper months and lay it down to have beer amply in the more difficult brewing months. And it's not just the Belgians or the Wallonians of the South Belgium, the rural South. that did this with Saison. The Northern French did it with what they called bière de garde. The Germans did it with Märzen. The English did it with stock ale. So this is a tradition that spans the beer making countries of Western Europe. And so basically you brew beer and you needed to have it for seasonal workers on the farm. And some people would let the beer sour, because when a beer sours, the pH lowers and it has keeping effect. It's the same reason that we pickle vegetables or fish, something like that. It can last longer. Some would add a lot of hops because hops have antibacterial properties, or they would add herbs and spices that also have antibacterial properties, maybe not as much as hops, but something. And even in the case of DuPont, up until the 1950s and 60s, if the hop crop wasn't great, they would add different herbs and spices to augment. So the idea was you'd brew a beer in March or April, lay it down in caves and bring it up as needed, or cellars, and bring it up as needed in the summer, typically for seasonal farm workers. And so that's why you see a lot of different grains utilized, because these farms were farms and not just breweries. So they might use barley, they may use wheat, they might use oats, they may use spelt, they may use rye. So you sometimes get a multi-grain aspect, but they would always be dry, because dryness means that beer will last longer. The less residual sugar in the beer means there's less things that could get you in trouble later if some yeast or bacteria happens to be about looking for fermentation opportunities. And that's how it goes. The DuPont farm and brewery in Torp in Hainaut province in southern Belgium, it's a farm that dates back to the 18th century. Alfred DuPont purchased the farm in 1920 or so as a gift to his son, to keep his son Louis from moving to Canada and starting his own farm there. And so now we're on our fourth generation. Olivier de Decker is running the show at DuPont now. They make about 10,000 barrels a year, which is not a massive amount at all. And I can do a comparison on that later. And it's become the benchmark of the style, and still really, really delicious. In the 1980s, an importer named Don Feinberg had a company called Van Bergen de Wolf. They were the first ones to bring Duvel over. I'm sure you all have seen that beer around. And they were using Michael Jackson, who's the famous beer and whiskey writer's Belgian beer guide, to determine which beers to bring in. And they went to DuPont and asked for Saison DuPont, and the brewers and owners at DuPont were shocked, because they were like, nobody drinks this beer anymore. People like the strong stuff. They like the Moynette Blonde. And actually they were considering discontinuing it. But Don said, no, we want to sell it. And they started exporting it to the US, and it took off and did very well. So one of the last things I'll say about Saisons is they always should have a sort of rustic yeast character. Now, it's not going to be as funky, certainly won't be acidic in the classic way, like the lambic, but rather than the kind of single cell yeast that so many breweries have worked hard to utilize and maintain and culture, a lot of the old farm breweries didn't have that kind of science or those yeast labs. And so their yeast tended to be multi-strained. They tended to have a little bit of a funky rustic complexity to them, not like Brettanomyces, but a little bit something else, something kind of lemony, white peppery, earthy, almost reminding you of the farm. And I think that DuPont does that well, and beers that use these kinds of yeast do that well too. One other thing I'll say about the Saison that I think is interesting, this DuPont Saison that I have is in a brown bottle. Most of the world's best Saisons, including some Saison DuPont bottles, are green. So if you love Saison DuPont and you want to try some other incredible styles, look out for anything from Blogy, which is a brewery that's right nearby, that actually utilizes the same yeast from DuPont. Thirier, which is a great brewery from northern France, right over the border. Oberon, which makes a wonderful Saison called Cuvée de Jonquille. All of those brewers use green bottles. And it's interesting that in the Second World War, brewers were using brown bottles whenever possible, because brown allows less UV light in than green does. And the more light that gets in, when light hits hops, it tends to cause a sulfury compound to jump out, which is that skunky character you experience when you drink Heineken and other green bottled lagers, imported lagers like that. And so most brewers preferred brown bottles. In the Second World War, sulfur, which is what you need to use to make a bottle brown rather than clear, was not as available because people were using that for gunpowder and other things. And so green bottles became more and more apparent. And they also kind of look more enticing on the shelf. So a lot of these brewers started using green bottles, and you don't get it as much in this beer, but when you drink a beer in a green bottle, a saison in a green bottle with a little bit of age, you get this beautiful, slightly skunky character that has become a real trademark of the style. And if you visit some of these breweries, I've heard told that oftentimes you'll see their bottles sitting in the window in direct sunlight, because they're even trying to encourage that kind of skunky character. It kind of sets them apart.
So Jeff was asking, this bottle says Belgian farmhouse ale. You hear that term thrown around a lot, farmhouse style. Is that, is it just a synonym for saison, or does it have any sort of agreed upon meaning, or can it kind of mean whatever you want?
It is marketing at its very best, as is the term saison. And that's what I was getting at earlier. I mean, saison, as you can imagine. So once upon a time, all beer was darker in color. The ability to make lighter colored beers like Pilsners or any of the two beers we've had today only comes from advanced malting methods that can dry grains without imparting a lot of heat and color to the grain. So really until the 17th century, most beers would have been brownish in color to dark amber. So when you know that obviously when you get to some of these like old school farms in Belgium, even up until the late 20th century, they're still all brewing brown beer. And they have beers they call saison that look and taste nothing like this. You know what I mean? So saison kind of as a style got related to this first and foremost. But then in the US, but then as brewers started to play around with the history of it, realized that saisons meant so many other things, and so has farmhouse ale, and started kind of exploring the opportunities and possibilities of those styles and calling them that. And so there was a time there where sour mixed fermentation beers were called saisons across the board in America. And I think that was a little bit misleading. So I think, that's kind of the thing. The other thing to keep in mind is that hops utilized in beer making didn't start until the 8th century Common Era. If beer's been being brewed for 10,000 years, that's a lot of years without hops. Before that, they were using herbs and spices to try to preserve the beer and flavor it. Medicinal things that like bog myrtle and yarrow, and even then cooking spices like coriander, rosemary, and that happened. The hops came from Hallertau in Germany. They don't take over in brewing until the 14th and 15th century Common Era. So, and actually at that time, that's where the term beer comes from. Beer indicates ale that's been hopped. So of course you can imagine that there were quite a few brewers in Belgium that continued to not use hops and herbs and spices, and maybe called their beer saisons as well. So it's kind of a term that's both meaningful and meaningless at the same time.
Thank you. Jeanette is saying she's got a saison du plomb that is in a green bottle. It says vieille provision, like old provision, old, and says it's. So she's just wondering, what's the difference there?
That is just trying to indicate classic in style. And it's actually the same thing when you think about lambic. Some of you are drinking framboise or gueuze that doesn't say oud gueuze or vieille gueuze or oud framboise. In the 20th century in Belgian brewing, sweetness became a thing. The whole Coca-Cola epidemic that legend has it Americans visited upon, Europeans during the Second World War, there certainly was a sweet tooth that developed, and dry beers became sweet, funky, dry, and tart. Lambics started being filtered and sweetened, made with fruit juices, barely made with any spontaneous beer anymore. And many saisons and strong beers started to be brewed with lots and lots of candy sugars, made quickly to taste uniform, sweet, and they all use the same terms for the beers: gueuze, framboise, saison. And so a lot of the more classic producers have gone out of their way to add things like VA and Uda to their labels to try to indicate a little bit more tradition and stuff that you should drink, rather than the sweet, simple, and basically, profit driven beers that came out of the Belgian beer renaissance.
I know time is marching on here, so we should probably move on pretty quick. But someone did ask if the saison would also age well.
It will, but I wouldn't suggest. Yeah, it would. And like I said, some of those saisons that are sour would age better. But this beer, to me, benefits from its hop character, and hoppiness subsides quickly in beer. So I would not age Saison DuPont at all, or most of the kind of blonde, dry, hop-forward saisons, like I mentioned, like Thierry Extra, or Cuvée des Jonquilles, or Blogy Saison d'Hypotre. All those beers should be drank as fresh as possible. That said, this isn't like a 16-ounce can of hazy IPA that goes bad after a couple of weeks. These do have 6 months on them. That'll be fine. But I wouldn't lay this down for a couple of years to see how it goes. Generally, for aging, strong and dark is the way to be if you want to do it, or acidic. Oxidation is going to plague beers as they age, and so you go through a period where there's some really nice fig and toffee and port wine characteristics, but then that can fall off, and you end up with newspaper, and so it can be kind of a tough game. Okay, Westmalle is next, if you have it. This is a brewery that I think keeps getting better, if that makes sense. It's a fascinating story. Obviously, Belgian beer, certainly in its mythology, would be nothing without the idea of monastic brewing. Monasticism starting in the 6th century with Benedict, and then a series of people feeling that the previous sect wasn't strict enough led to new sects being created, including the Cistercians in the 11th century. And then they weren't strict enough. So the Trappists broke off in the 17th century. And they remain an order of self-sustaining monasteries around the world. There's 14 beer-producing Trappist monasteries now, 6 of which are in Belgium. Westmalle is the first, and still one of the great ones, even though it's a pretty massive brewery with a lot of secular influence. The monks are not brewing every drop here like they are at West Vleteren. And but at the same time, I find Westmalle Triple remains consistently outstanding, even though it is available, and even though the brewery is pretty big. The brewery makes about 12 times as much beer as DuPont does, Westmalle, which is why it's so available, but also pretty interesting that they're able to produce as much. Not nearly as much as Chimay. And I do think that Westmalle, for a bigger brewery, a bigger Trappist, does a better job of slow fermentations, cooler fermentations, longer maturation times, whereas Chimay, to me, tends to rush things a bit. The beers are a little bit simpler and sweeter, not as complex. But yeah, so Westmalle Triple, the monastic tradition goes back 1,500 years, like I said, but monks really had a hand in pushing forward beer like study, but also the mastery of beer making. They were the universities of their day back in the Middle Ages. They were also the inns of the day, so they made a lot of money selling beer to a lot of people traveling on the road. And they kind of professionalized brewing in a lot of ways. They also figured out a way to make different kinds of beers from the same amount of grain at different levels of alcohol. So when you see things like double and triple and quadruple, which is a recent style, it all comes from the fact that if you take one big amount of grain, You mash it in with water. You pull the first runnings off, you're going to pull a lot of sugar. If you hop that sugar water, ferment it, you're going to create strong beer. If you do second runnings, it's going to have less sugar. It's going to be not as strong. Third runnings, not as strong. And so the strongest beer would be held for the Abbot. That's why they're typically called Abt, ABT, or Grand Cru. We now call them quadruple. The next level down might be for the Patters beer for the fathers to kind of drink. And then the smallest level may be held for just table drinking. Westmalle monks fled the French Revolution and headed up to Antwerp in the middle, about 1830s. They were on their way to America. They received protection from the Dutch, and so they stayed there, started brewing 20 years later, and have been brewing ever since. This is the triple style, takes a stronger Belgian beer and adds Pilsner malt. So it's kind of like a strong beer for people who like Pilsners. What I like so much, and this is a style that comes from the 1930s, so it's relatively recent. What's great about this beer to me is that while it has sweetness and flavors of peach and apricot and rose petals and a little bit of banana, it also has a dryness to it. It's not too boozy. It has an herbal, earthy quality that comes through in the finish that keeps it drinkable and moreish on the palate. There's a myth that Belgians, drank a lot of strong beer in the 1920s and 30s after they went through Prohibition, because they famously prohibited spirit drinking, like Genever, at bars. That's not true. People drank a lot of mostly low alcohol beer through the 20s and 30s, and that's mostly because of wartime rationing. They couldn't make strong beer if they wanted to. It was after the Second World War, when rationing was relaxed and soda came in to compete with 2% table beer, that the Belgians started experimenting and pushing beer up with stronger beer. And it wasn't really until the 1980s then people started to celebrate traditional Belgian beer, and the Belgians themselves tried to celebrate the culinary tradition of being Belgian, that strong beers took off. So while this beer has been around since the 30s, it was called super beer back then. They started calling it triple in the 50s. The idea that people love big, huge Belgian strong beers really comes to us from the past 30 years. How's everybody doing? Almost drank all three? There you go.
You're doing great.
All right.
A couple of questions on this beer. Antoinette had a question that passed through my mind when we poured the first one. You were talking about how you want a head on it, and I think a lot of us have been taught, maybe by our dads, no, tilt the glass, pour down the side, don't want it too foamy. So we want to head on all of these, and that's really, does that apply across the board for all beers, would you say, or does it depend on the style?
100%. Every single beer should have it. It looks beautiful. It presents best. It gives the aromatic complexity, and then its texture. Texture cannot be understated here. When you pour carefully and slowly, you rob the beer of that effervescence on the palate. It's the same reason why drinking real ale on cask, if you're in Britain or Scotland or at one of my bars in the States, I'm one of the last publicans to still push cask beer, you get a different kind of texture. Over time, I've become more and more obsessed with texture. And so to carefully, finagle a beer so that it's still is not a good idea, unless you're just going to plug your nose and bang it back like a Busch Light or something like that. So, but with these beers, you want to be careful to really build that head.
Very cool. Thanks. And this was my own question. I don't know if anyone else, maybe I missed it, but could you clarify what you were talking about with the first running being the strongest, the second running being weaker? What are you talking about there? What are runnings?
Yeah. So the runnings are, when you make beer, you take a bunch of grain and you mill it to get more surface area. You add it to a mash tun and bring in a bunch of water. That's the first step. And then you start to cook it. You're creating basically an oatmeal type substance. You're going to filter that and send it over to the kettle in liquefied form. Now it's sugar water. That's what we call wort. And in the kettle is when you add hops, maybe some spices. And after that's done and you boiled it, you have something called wort, sugar water that's been spiced or hopped. And from there, you cool that off, put it into a fermenter, add your yeast, and you ferment the wort into beer. Okay. So if whatever the amount of grain is you decide, that's called your grist. And so the idea was that if you put a bunch of water into the grist and you pull it, you bring out the sugar water, well, you've got a bunch of leftover spent grain remaining. So people used to get taxed pretty heavily on how much grain they use or the size of their mash tuns. And so they try to eke out every possible sugar and just keep bathing it in more and more water with more and more runnings. So the first pull would give you the most sugar, makes sense. The second pull, you'd be eking out less, third less, fourth less. And so with less sugar means you have less opportunities for higher alcohol. And so the first beer would be the biggest, strongest beer. That'd be reserved for the abbot. The next beer would be slightly, less strong. That would go to the fathers. And then the final beer would be the one that they would drink with breakfast. It'd be 2% or something like that.
Got it. Thank you. That's great. I've heard of a similar thing being done with grapes in winemaking. Mm-hmm. To get sort of a lighter, lower alcohol wine as well.
I love my boy Steve Messenger sending up a link here for anybody who's looking for stuff. I should probably be doing that. Yeah. So okay, let's quickly talk about the last beer. What would be this is great. I want to touch on this. What would be the limitation of producing an identical beer to the Belgian beers here in the US? Well, one of our attendees tonight, I'm going to call him out, is Rob Todd, who is a Middlebury grad and owns the best Belgian brewery outside of Belgium called Allagash Brewing Company up in Portland, Maine. Rob and I are good friends, and that's one of my favorite breweries in the world. So there's limitations for sure. There's a lot of tricks and know-how that come from hundreds of years of brewing and the brewing universities over there. But Rob and Jason Perkins and his team have done an amazing job of recreating Belgian beer stateside. That said, they're one of very few who've done it well. And one of the positive things about people moving towards hazy IPAs and fruited sours and pastry stouts is that they've stopped making mediocre Belgian beers in the US. It's really hard. It's yeast handling. It's proper fermentation temps. It's handling the beers. It's not rushing the beer. It's paying attention to sensory. It's constantly changing the beer and working on it and nibbling away at the edges to make the beer perfect. It's ingredient sourcing. Some of the best breweries in Belgium, like De Ranke or De La Seine, are what they are because they only utilize and select the very best hops for their beers. And so, yeah, those are some of the reasons why it's been very hard. And also a shout out to drink imported beer. There is no one doing Belgian beer like De La Seine or De Ranke in the United States. American spontaneous beer is good. Allagash makes fantastic spontaneous beers under the Spawn series. Jester King is under the Spawn series, Allagash under the Coolship series. But there's something different about true Belgian lambic from Cantillon and Tilquin and Drie-Fontein and Ticam, Girardin. There's a place for all of it, and that's something that I've really striven for in my career, is to maintain this kind of discussion and collaboration between American and international brewers on my lists, because they're really amazing. I mean, there are German lagers out there that cannot be touched by the stuff made stateside, including those from a wonderful brewery called Schönraum, or another called Traunstein. So yeah, drink imports, sure. All right, last one is the St. Bernardus Christmas Ale. So a Belgian strong dark ale, 10% alcohol. Another thing the Belgians are known for is being coy about their processes and ingredients and perhaps leading people astray. This brewery swears that there's no spices in this beer, and I love them dearly and know them very well, but I'm not sure I believe that. The story of this beer has only been around for about 15 years. It was brewed originally as a 60th anniversary beer for a beer called St. Bernardus Ap 12, which was brewed in 1946 for the first time. So in 2006, they brewed it. they claim that they made a different version of AB 12, strong dark beer with different malts and different hops that happened to be more spicy. And I get that cinnamon, nutmeg spice right off the nose, but not as intensely as it can be. It's not potpourri. There's wonderful kind of caramel, toasty, nutty flavors here. I get more of that kind of apricot note for sure. A little bit of orange, fig and raisin. And not overly sweet, which is a really great thing for this. So St. Bernardus is a brewery that has been around since 1946. They started as a cheesemaker. And in 1946, after the Second World War, the monks of West-Vlaanderen, which is the smallest monastic brewing operation besides Akel in West Flanders, Belgium, went to the cheesemaker and said, would you guys make some beer for us? It's interrupting our life, and we'd love you to make it for us under contract, and we can use the proceeds for self-sustaining and for funding future monastic endeavors. And so they did for the next 46 years. In 1992, they got serious about Trappist designations on beers. And so West-Vlaanderen had to take their brewing back so that they can continue to say that they were truly made by monks. And West-Vlaanderen is impossible to get. You have to go to the brewery. You have to use a whole new online system that only allows you to buy 3 cases every 2 months. And the beers are incredible. But St. Bernardus has continued to brew the beers of West-Vlaanderen for the last 46 plus years. I'm sorry, since 92 and beyond, since 46. And so in many ways, St. Bernardus AB 12 is the original St. Sixtus AB 12. They use the original West-Vlaanderen yeast. If you get West-Vlaanderen beers today, you're actually drinking it with Westmalle yeast, because when they started brewing again in 1992, they leaned on their brethren at Westmalle to use their yeast. So when you drink the beers of St. Bernardus next to West-Vlaanderen, you fruitier, a little bit more banana. The West-Vlaanderen beers are a little bit maltier, richer, and possibly a little bit more complex. So the holiday beer tradition is huge for Belgians. I think there's been this idea that it's because brewers have been making special beers for their customers forever and adding fruits and spices. That's actually not it. The Brits started marketing and exporting beer to Belgium, well, a lot in the 18th and 19th century, but they started exporting Scotch ale, strong dark beers with Christmas monikers in the holiday season. And Belgians love that. And as with any company or any country that sees success with an import, they start to make it themselves. And so Belgian brewers started making strong dark beers in the Scotch ale style and calling them holiday beers. So this is a kind of a good way to wrap up, because it shows that the strong brewing tradition existed in Belgium, but in fact, the Christmas ale and holiday ale tradition comes to them from the British Isles.
Very cool. Thank you. I know we're coming on right up on 8 o'clock, but we might run just a minute or two over. We did have a few questions from the chat. Some of them, not too many yet on this beer, but this might be a chance to go back and cover a couple of sort of general purpose. And feel free to keep chatting your questions, and we might not, like I said, we might not get to everything, but we were talking about American versions of Belgian beers, and someone asked, what's your opinion on, now, of course, you already praised Allagash. Any opinions on Omegang in Cooperstown?
Omegang, actually, it's funny, the importer I mentioned earlier, Don Feinberg from Bamberger de Wolf, that brought in DuPont, started Omegang Brewery and then sold it to Duvel. I think Omegang has made a lot of great Belgian style beers. Worked really well with bottle re-fermentation, but the world is changing, and I don't even want to say it's unfortunate that they haven't been able to keep on their Belgian path, but they just haven't had the success that some other brewers have with maintaining the Belgian portfolio. And so they're still making Belgian beer, and it's still good, but they're spending more time with some of the more the trendier styles, which makes perfect sense to me. They have to continue to survive to make the beers they want. But McGong's done a lot. Their beer festivals are incredible, and I think if you can find like Three Philosophers and Abbey Ale and things like that, Rare Voss, Witta, they're especially in 750 mils. Those are phenomenal throwback beers that are really delicious.
Very cool. Someone, I know you had mentioned that you were going to touch on this. So Jacob Manukin mentioned glassware. Is there any particular rhyme or reason to what style you should drink out of what glass?
Always use a glass, and the general rule of thumb is that the crisper, more refreshing styles you may serve a little bit colder, that are lower in ABV, should be served in cylindro-conical glasses that hold more volume. And as the beers become stronger and richer and heavier, they should be dispensed in smaller glasses with more curvature, maybe with stems that can be sipped rather than drank. So that's why, I don't know if you saw, but I was drinking the Saison DuPont out of a glass that kind of is in between, because it's a drinker, 6.5% alcohol, crisp, refreshing. But then when you get to the headier 10%, you're going into the goblet that allows a lot of aromatic investigation and sips rather than gulps. That's the general rule of thumb.
Cool. So is the tulip shape, is that more about encouraging sipping or containing aromas, or a little bit of both?
A little bit of both. The tulip shape it keeps the beer a little bit colder. You're not touching it as much. It focuses aroma, and allows you to kind of get a great big, sip. The goblet or chalice style, you couldn't, if you tried to bang this, you just like get it all over yourself. So this is more about aromatic investigation, small sips, and it's also paying homage to some of the parochial underpinnings of the style. So
Cool. Going back to the first beer, I was wondering about the bottle, the champagne style cork. Is this fermented in bottle, or what's the explanation for that?
Exactly. So all of these beers are fermented in bottle, which is one of the coolest things about them. They finish a fermentation in stainless steel tank. They get matured for longer. A lot of initial fermentations create big, huge aromas, big flavors that lack complexity. They're overwrought, overwhelming, and simplistic. Over time, when you age in cold and tank or lager the beer, the bigger flavors come down. You get a better pastiche of complex flavors, more things going on. But you lose a lot of carbonation. So when you fill in the bottle, you will either dose with a little bit of still fermenting beer or with some sugar and yeast and spark a re-fermentation. And then keeping those bottles at the right temp allows that fermentation to go slowly over time, build up great effervescence, and also give a little bit more complexity to the beer. In the case of the Dre Fontainen, that was in the champagne style bottle, this is blended and goes into the bottle with no additional sugar. So it's just the existing yeast and bacteria, the as yet unfermented sugar that sparks the re-fermentation over about a 6-month period. And so when you get it and you pour it, it's got that beautiful effervescence and complexity you would not get if you did it otherwise, if you force carbonated it like you would like soda water or something like that. And forced carbonating is a no-no because it tends to blow off a lot of the aromatics that the brewer has worked so hard to instill into the beer. Bottle conditioning is one of the great things about Belgian beer. And also with bottle conditioning, you get constant CO2 buildup, which keeps oxygen out. So these are beers that in this format not only showcase care and long maturation and fermentation, it also means they can last longer because there's less opportunity for oxygen to get in.
Awesome. I know we're just a little bit past 8 o'clock, so I think we'll just finish with, do you have a favorite Vermont beer you'd like to mention?
I have a lot of friends in Vermont, lots of great breweries in Vermont. But I firmly believe Hill Farmstead is possibly the best brewery in the world. And Sean Hill is a very close friend of mine, but his beers are just incredible. And I think that it's a place that everyone should try to go to more if they can already. And once we can get back out on the road, getting up to Greensboro, it is phenomenal. Of course, Sean Lawson's beers are incredible too. I love them so much. Foam brewers make delicious beers. Frost, uh, amazing. And I'll even throw it back to the Long Trail double bag that used to keep me happy at Middlebury in 2000. But and Otter Creek and everything else. I mean, it's an incredible thing. I cut my teeth. One of the things I cut my teeth on was going to the Vermont Brew Pub while I was at Middlebury and Burlington and tasting beers from all over the place. Greg Noonan was an incredible guy and did so much there. But Vermont's an incredibly special place for beer, and it's kind of nuts how many outstanding breweries are there. So you all are those of us who were there are lucky. Those that are still there, like you, Matt, are very lucky to be there.
Awesome, that's great. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Greg. This has been fantastic. I think people really enjoyed it.